The longtime leader of Mexico's powerful teachers union has been charged with embezzling millions of dollars from the union. Is the arrest of Elba Esther Gordillo just a political ploy or part of an attempt to reform the country's education system? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Kimberly Halkett. Well, she's known as La Maestra, or the teacher. And until this week, Elba Esther Gordillo headed the National Union of Education Workers, or SNTE, which is estimated to have 1.5 million members. It's a significant voting bloc in Mexico. With Gordillo's backing, it helped to swing a close presidential election in Felipe Calderon's favor in 2006. And a generation of Mexican presidents have steered clear of taking on Gordillo, despite years of allegations of corruption and accusations that the union was undermining the education system. Well, less than half of Mexican students complete high school, despite nearly 1/4 of the country's annual budget going to education. Critics say most of the money is spent on teachers' salaries, but many times teachers who were paid either didn't exist or were deceased. But change may be underway. Reforms enacted a day before Gordillo's arrest seek to weaken the union's hold on hiring and evaluating teachers. President Peña Nieto says hiring will be based only on merit instead of the old system under which teaching positions could be either sold or inherited. But some question whether Gordillo's arrest is more of a political move by the ruling PRI, which clashed with her back in 2006. Opposition legislators say Peña Nieto also needs to move against other powerful union bosses to ensure lasting change. Well, for more on the story, joining me in the studio is Irma Sandoval. She is an associate professor at the Institute for Social Research of National Autonomous University of Mexico. From Mexico City, we have Mois Cherem. He is founder and CEO of Enova, a Mexican education advocacy group that operates schools and focuses on the use of technology and learning. And also here in our studio in Washington, D.C., Christopher Wilson, who is an associate at the Mexico Institute of the Woodrow Wilson Center. Well, Mois, I'd like to start with you. Talk to me a little bit about the situation here that we have with Elba Esther Gordillo. She's behind bars, charged or for alleged embezzlement of union funds. What has happened to education in Mexico as a result of her leadership of the union?
Well, I think we need to focus on what happened the day before, which was the enactment of a constitutional reform whereby the system will change significantly. Essentially, the concept of merit was included in the Constitution. Mexico still needs to work on the secondary laws, but what we see is a nationwide agreement to make education a priority and to improve how our students are being educated every single day. The arrest, I think, is a very symbolic and powerful act. However, the Claudio X González, who is the head of Mexicanos Primero, which is one of the NGOs that has been the most vocal about the problems with the Mexican educational system, said on that evening that we essentially have the same system. We have the same teachers, we have the same students. So we need to, this was a matter of accountability. It was important as a symbol to initiate criminal charges for activities that were out of bounds. However, I think all of us in Mexico need to focus on what comes next, which is how we fix an education system that needs a lot of work.
Well, indeed, that is the headline, the sort of the reforms that are now in place and have been made law. But at the same time, what is the starting point here for these reforms? Perhaps you can talk to us a little bit about that, Irma. I mean, what is the situation like currently and what needs to be repaired?
Yeah, I think that this is politics as usual in Mexico. I think that the tension and this action against Elba Esther Gordillo unfortunately doesn't mean a real commitment against corruption or for accountability or for the establishment of a real regime of accountability in our country. I think that it is pretty traditional, pretty typical that when you have a political rivalry as clear as the one that is with Elbester Gordillo, this is pretty traditional. I mean, Enrique Peña Nieto, the new president of Mexico, chose Elbester Gordillo as an ideal target to demonstrate or to try to get the legitimacy that he didn't get at the polls. And I think that what is at stake here is more of a political move. What is at stake here is something that goes beyond education and the project of a real modernization of the education in Mexico City. We unfortunately see this political rivalry as more of, this is not a question of accountability, it's more of a settlements of accounts, and that's really a pity in our political context right now.
Christopher, let's get you to weigh in on this. It doesn't sound like this is about education reform, is the headline that I seem to be getting here.
I think it's a matter of both, and this is sort of an interesting case where good politics and good policy may have fortunately lined up, which is to say there was clearly some political rivalries. Elbester was previously a part of the PRI, even the chairman of the PRI, which is the governing party, later broke away and allied herself with the PAN, which governed previous to this year's elections. And now there was some score settling to be done. So that's probably the case. But at the same time, as Mois mentioned, there's serious challenges to the education system in Mexico. And one of the reasons that there were such serious challenges is that the teachers' union had really held power over the education system for years. And so if there's...
how was that allowed to perpetuate for so long? We're not just talking a few years here. We're talking decades, 4 presidents.
Right, and even more than that, actually. I mean, this really goes back to the corporatist structure that made up Mexico before democratization. So in that structure, when the teachers' union was created, it was created to work in alliance with the government to help hold control over society. So they, the teachers' union got to run the show in terms of running education in the country, and the old PRI would therefore get their votes and their support on lots of other issues. It was a marriage of convenience. But at this point, with democratization, it's a much more competitive political system. It's a much more complicated system to hold together in that old way. There's been a split, and hopefully education and the children and Mexico's economy will be winning as a result of that.
Mois, are you optimistic that hopefully children will be winning as a result of what's happened? Do you think that these reforms are going to achieve the goal?
I am very optimistic. The fact that we're seeing the new government putting so much political capital in education demonstrates a true resolve to fix one of the country's most pressing problems. Any change in education takes a lot of time, and I think right now they'll be bearing some of the costs, but I think in 5 years from now, we'll see a system that has better teachers. And I think that, especially on the side of the civil society, we need to focus on how we help the entire system to succeed. So how we help teachers. For example, there have been many interventions that involve putting more technology in schools. So we need to have a constructive dialogue with teachers on how they can make how they can take the best advantages out of that technology. We also need to involve parents. They need to spend more time reading with their kids. This is a nationwide problem that basically requires nationwide solutions. So the fact that someone is out of the system is only, a preliminary part of the equation. However, I think the fact that we're seeing so much political will from the new government is something to be very optimistic about.
Well, Mois, I want to take a look, all of you, at some of these reforms that are being put into place. Now, supporters of the new education law say that, in fact, it will shift control over the school system to the government from the teachers' union. Now, take a look at this. It seeks to introduce merit-based hiring and promotion instead of appointments by the union. Teachers will also have to undergo regular assessments, and a census will be held to identify the number of schools, teachers, and students in the country. Now, the reform also extends learning hours in some 40,000 public schools. The union says the reforms could lead to massive layoffs, and other critics argue the changes could help bring in privatization of education in Mexico. Well, Irma, are some of these criticisms founded? I mean, are these legitimate concerns, or is this, again, political back and forth?
I really think that it's important to not put a lot of responsibility in the teachers themselves. Of course, Elbester Gordillo is an epitome of corruption. It's a clear example of corporativism, of opacity, of corruption. But she is not the only one. She is more of a product of the authoritarian and corrupt political system that we have in Mexico during many years than the real cause of the problem, and in particularly in the education. If we have such a strong and important educative system in Mexico, is precisely because the hard work of teachers themselves every day. I mean, they work under very bad conditions every day, and they do their best to keep the system education on its feet. And so I really think that is a little bit unfair to put all the responsibility on the teacher sector, on the teachers, and we should look at the political battles that are at stake. And another important question that we need to look at is the oil industry. Some of the critics of Enrique Peña Nieto have said that what is at stake in this ajuste de cuentas, in this settling of accounts, is basically his proposal of the privatization of our most important industry, that is the oil industry. And I do believe that we should listen to those arguments, and to the very same day that he did this move against Elbester Gordillo, he also announced his political proposal of taking away the subsidy of gas, of gasoline, and I mean, he's playing with both cards at the same time, right?
Christopher, I guess if politics, or sure, Mois, do you want to respond to that?
No, I mean, Kimberly, just going back to your question, I don't think in any of the two reforms you have anything that could objectively lead you to conclude that education will be privatized. However, you could even make an analogy with the oil industry, which is that all sectors need to collaborate. So for education to be fixed, we do need to see a stronger involvement of the social and the private sectors as people who are helping the public system, which will remain public on all accounts. I don't think anyone in the government has even mentioned anything close to privatizing education. I also wanted to point out the example of the Scandinavian countries where you have public sector unions that are very strong, but you have a very strong sense of accountability, and you also have a lot of very talented young people moving into the teaching profession. So I think that's something that we should aspire to as Mexico, rather than having just a system that relies on either private sector or other mechanisms. We need to focus on a system in which we're bringing in the best and most talented young people to become teachers.
But Christopher, I'm wondering, the pattern I'm hearing here is that politics has been the problem for so many decades. That's what led to some of the problems and really leaving education in a bit of a mess. So if now the government is sort of wrestling control and the union will not have the control it once had, are those problems going to be overcome?
Well, I think that Mois is right to point out that this is really the education reform and the rest of Elbester Gordillo is really just one step. I mean, that won't alone solve Mexico's education problems. That is a good step, and it's a step in the right direction, but there's much more that civil society needs to do, and indeed the government needs to do to go beyond that first step to have real change. I think that this is the education reform is something that's going to take a lot of time before it really starts to bear fruit. And that's because the teachers that are already hired won't be fired if they're not performing well. They're sort of grandfathered into the system and are still going to have some protection. So this is going to be a process that really takes a lot of time. But nonetheless, it's a very positive step, and I think that we should recognize that.
And while it is a positive step, talk to me a little bit, though, Christopher, about how the union has really undermined education for a generation.
Yeah, well, it's really just, I mean, you have a case where you have, we noticed that there will now be a census of how many schools and teachers there are. I mean, isn't that amazing that you need to have a census because the government itself doesn't know how many teachers and how many schools are out there? It's the union that has that information. So this is just one example of sort of the way that the union has, to a certain extent, usurped the government in the area of education. It's a process that, as I sort of said before, it was an alliance that was created for political purposes, but it's sort of run its course, and the time has certainly come for Mexico to step ahead because, and this is really important because Mexico's economy is at a point where it's not going to make gains just based on more people entering the labor force or anything like that. It's going to take human capital being developed. It's going to take higher education, science and technology and innovation. And to have people that are prepared for those types of university careers, they need to have strong secondary and primary education, and that's something that's been lacking. Even though Mexico's been spending a lot of money, Mexico spends plenty of money on education as a percentage of its
budget.
Yeah, and over 5% of GDP, which is another measure that by all international standards should be enough. It's the results that haven't been up to par, and that's this is, again, a step in the right direction, but there's a lot more to do.
But Irma, how was it that this was under the radar for so long, or perhaps it wasn't? I mean, like the allegations towards Elba, I said her name wrong, Elba Esther Gordillo, they're pretty stark. I mean, we've got Swiss bank accounts as part of the allegations, plastic surgery, expensive accounts at U.S. department stores. How did anyone not notice that something wasn't quite right?
Precisely. I think that you are pointing out a very important question, a very important point, is that this is not new. This is, as I was mentioning, this is politics as usual in Mexico. And the action against Elbester Gordillo is also very reminiscent of what former President Carlos Salinas de Gortari did against one very important leader, union leader during his time, the General Secretary of the Union of the oil industry, the oil industry workers. What happened there was something similar. It was a settlement of accounts, and he was in jail for a while. The person who took his place turned out to be a equally corrupt or even worse corrupt person in charge and control of that big union. And this is precisely the main danger that we are facing right now, that if they do this against Elbester Gordillo, they probably will put in her place an equally corrupt person, and it seems that that is going to be the case, at least a person that is completely related politically with her enormous power, and that is going to be changing for nothing to change in reality, and that's a very clear danger in Mexico.
And that's exactly why it's so important that this isn't just an arrest, but it moves towards a conviction. There are too many times the sort of high-profile arrests and measures that look like important steps in terms of anti-corruption in Mexico end with somebody getting off scot-free.
Well, that's what I wonder. Is she a scapegoat in all of this?
Well, I think everyone knows that she may be a scapegoat, but she was also, the accusations are quite likely correct. I think that it's widely known that she did have all these homes, and where could she have possibly gotten that money? But the question is there a case there to make sure that she's put in jail so that the next person will have the incentive to not repeat the same thing?
Because I think her annual salary was about $86,000 US equivalency.
Exactly.
I mean, you certainly could not afford, you know, multiple homes and the kind of lifestyle, I think, on that kind of a salary.
She might not be a scapegoat, but she's clearly an ideal target and an easy one right now. An easy target for Enrique Peña Nieto, and his capture is not showing a real commitment against corruption in our country.
Mois, do you agree with that?
No, actually I don't. And I think we are forgetting of the constitutional reform that passed the day before. In the case of Carlos Salinas, there was an arrest, but the structure of the oil industry remained pretty much the same. Here we had a very strong systemic change before, and then a change in leadership. So that's why I think we should be optimistic. We now have a system that formally recognizes merit as the base to assign teaching jobs. And I think that is what will lead to the change more than whomever is the head outside of the union. I would also like to point out that right now it looks like a safe bet, but going after someone with the amount of power that Elbester Gordillo has is definitely risky. So I think that the fact that the government went after her is basically a show of resolve to implement change and to do that quickly.
But let me ask you this, Mois. Could these reforms have been achieved with her still at the helm of the union?
I don't think so, because she was actually opposing them already. So again, as it was being mentioned, she was an obstacle, and it is very healthy that we don't have her anymore.
So this is a healthy turning point in Mexico. Is this what you're saying? This is sort of a watershed moment. This is a turning point for education in Mexico. Politics aside.
It is. It is. We still need to do all of the work, and it will take many years. But again, what I'm hopeful about is the constitutional reform and how we are working to have a better educational system.
Do you agree with that? That this is a significant moment. This is a turning point.
No. I again.
You're skeptical.
More than skeptical. It's not a question of optimism versus skepticism or pessimism. It's a question of awareness. It's a question of history, and we should remember that we are an example worldwide as a country of reforms. We always are at the forefront in the reforms. We are an ideal type country in terms of transparency, for example, and right now we are in the middle of a crisis of our main agency of transparency in Mexico. We are an exemplary internationally at the electoral reforms, and we again are in the middle of a political and very deep political crisis in the country. And so I wouldn't put all my hope on any single reform if they don't change structurally the political way in which the things works in Mexico and of course Elbester Gordillo was an epitome of this corrupt system, but she was more a product of the system than the cause. She is more a clear product of this opacity of this corruption than the generator of the problem. And in order to change things in Mexico, we should really think in a more structural manner and a more for example, the proposal of the new president, of Enrique Peña Nieto, is to disappear our Secretary of Combat of Corruption, the Secretary of Public Function. That's really, really dangerous for the way for our public matters in the country, because we will not have any agency in charge of civil service, and that is going to deepen even more the corruption in general. He is also proposing to reform the IFAI, our Agency of Transparency, right, in order to control it more in his hands. So I think it's pretty.
But okay, go ahead.
Yeah,
I'm
sure.
just wondering how this is being.
I'm sorry, I would just like to point out we need to depoliticize education and focus on the actual steps that make education improve. So for example, right now, a huge area of opportunity are the universities that train teachers. Right now, their quality is extremely poor. So that is, for example, an issue that we can fix with little political discussion, and that essentially involves technique. You know, how do you train a teacher to be a good leader, to be effective with students? And those are the types of steps we should be thinking about rather than, the broader political issues.
Okay, and very quickly, we've only got a minute left, but I want to ask you, how is this being received in Mexico? I mean, what are people thinking? Are they looking at this positively, or are they saying business as usual? Mois?
I think, and right now I will speak as a social entrepreneur, I have never experienced so much optimism in my lifetime. I feel that markets are turning to Mexico as an engine for growth, and that, again, we still need to do all of the work, but I think as a society, to the extent that we can start demonstrating that we can tackle our most pressing issues, such as education, we can really start building momentum to really take Mexico to the next level.
All right, last few seconds for you, Christopher.
If I can just sum it up in a couple words, I would say Mexico has come an incredible way in the last 20 years. towards democratization, and Mexico has a long way to go to really get to the point where it can be an economy and a society of the 21st century.
All right, we're going to leave it there. We appreciate you all coming in and talking to us here on Inside Story. That is all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. I want to remind you, don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook. You can find more information about our program. We also want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas to us directly here at Inside Story at aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching Inside Story America.